Thank you. I appreciate the introduction. It's a joy to be with you all here at the conference, and such as it is with our electronic distancing. So my topic is looking at racism and its grounding in shame and disgust. And I want to begin with a quote from the book of Sirach. One of those books that too many Orthodox Christians forget is in the canon. But from the 4th chapter of Sirach, the statement reads, "For there is a shame that brings sin, and there is a shame which is glory and grace." There's a popular definition of shame that describes it as how we feel about who we are. And along with this, there's a definition of guilt as a feeling of how we feel about what we have done. So shame, how I feel about who I am. Guilt, how I feel about what I've done. Those are oversimplifications, but they're a useful place to start and something to remember. Because race in our culture is a central part of how we see ourselves, that is, who I am. It is inherently the case that shame is involved, since shame is about how I feel about who I am. So today, I want to take us much deeper into the phenomenon of shame and see what's really going on, how we can deal with it, how it affects our relationships. And finally, I'll try to offer some thoughts on the place that shame holds in our spiritual life, both shame that is of a sinful nature as well as healthy shame, which is glory and grace. So I will start off by saying we are hardwired for shame. I'll explain that. And I pray this is not going to be a distraction here at first, but it's very worth considering before we think about any other aspect of shame, to think about the actual neurobiological basis of the experience of shame. That is how our brains and bodies are wired for this experience. The psychologist Sylvan Tompkins first identified 9 structures in our human wiring that he labeled as affects, A-F-F-E-C-T-S, affects. They are distress or anguish, interest or excitement, enjoyment or joy, surprise or our startle reflex, anger and rage, fear or terror, shame or humiliation, disgust, that is, I want to spew something out, and dismell. Can't stand how it smells. These are reactions that are inborn. They're not a product of the fall. They're a product of being human. Just simply think for a minute about the surprise, startle affect. When we play peekaboo with an infant, the child doesn't need to be taught how to play the game. An infant knows the game because it consists in our surprising them, that is, engaging a reflex that has been there from the beginning, that certainly manifests within the very first year of life. Tompkins theorized that these primitive affects wired in our body combine later with our life experience over time to form emotions and the major aspects of our personality. So it's useful to identify this, and I found it, as I've lectured on the topic of shame, very important and written on it. It's very important to talk about this because when we speak of shame, we tend to have in mind those more developed emotional experiences with all of their associations. But it's useful to think about it in its most fundamental aspects, particularly when you come to think of what is called healthy shame, that I'll explain later. It'll be necessary to speak of healthy shame in order to discover the route past toxic shame and towards healing. So at this primary level, shame, as a reaction of my brain and body, Shame is simply an affect that is one of self-protection. It's a self-protection signal. It marks a stop in our experience. It can be as innocent as signaling a boundary that I shouldn't go there. Interestingly, it's also the affect that is perhaps most deeply involved in our experience of the holy. Think for a moment about someone entering a holy place, such as an old cathedral. We instinctively, meaning, and one of our affects is involved, we instinctively become quiet, lowering our voice to a whisper. It's the instinct of self-protection, that there's something here, a boundary, I should whisper. There's some sort of vulnerability that we're undergoing. It would be, as C.S. Lewis says, Aslan is not exactly a tame lion. So we approach carefully. And it can be said that we hide in a certain way, even if the hiding is simply to lower the volume of our voice. It would be possible, I think, to do an entire presentation on this alone, but we have much harder work to do today. This fundamental affect of self-protection easily becomes mired in very negative, dangerous experiences. And the body remembers these things. An immediate question for us, how does this have anything to do with the shame question of how I feel about who I am? A good story for thinking about this is the Genesis account in the garden. Created by God, we are naked, it says, and unashamed. There is no boundary of vulnerability between the man and the woman and God. They are utterly and completely safe. But with the first sin, we are told, they become aware of their nakedness, and there's a new feeling, that of being unsafe and exposed, and they hide. It is the most primal reaction of shame. Commonly, and this is interesting, we experience shame most notably in the face. When we're embarrassed, which is mild shame, when we're embarrassed, blood rushes to our face. We blush. We turn our face away. We look down. We cannot make eye contact. And in doing that, we hide. We cannot look at each other. Nothing is more exposed or exposing than our sense of self-identity. Most of our lives are in fact spent hiding in one manner or another. We're told that God clothed Adam and Eve with garments of skin. I always think of those as Flintstone outfits. It says he clothed them with garments of skin. And we've continued to clothe ourselves with garments that seek to define our identity or to hide it. Tattoos, for instance, very popular in our current culture. They serve to clothe us with marks of identity. And of course, the clothing of our racial characteristics provides another such identity marker, one that cannot be hidden, though there's ways that we play with it. The same is true of, for instance, of language dialects. All the various clues to our identity risk exposing us to unwanted and even dangerous attention. As such, we spend a fair amount of time seeking to control precisely whatever it is that we expose of ourselves to others. We join groups, for instance. One way of hiding is to be part of a group. We join groups whose music or whose style of dress, whose use of words, etc., mark us as members, and that for us creates a sense of safety and protection in our belonging. A bit of an aside here, it's worth noting that in adolescence, as we move outside of the protective intimacy of the family and into the more social world that will eventually become the place of our adulthood, that it's there that we begin to make these first forays into creating identities. Adolescents and teens are extremely prone to clump themselves into cliques. It's also the time where we begin to see bullying come to the fore, as some seek to define themselves by exerting dominance over others. Shame can be brutal. Make no mistake, bullying is all about shame. It only works with shame. Our intimate relationships, of course, are intimate precisely because it's there where we expose ourselves the most. So as such, they are potentially the most dangerous places in our lives, just as they are potentially the safest places in our lives. So while I am speaking about the shame affect, I also want to touch on the affects of disgust and dismell. Disgust is our signal to spit something out. Dismell tells us to avoid something. Anyone who's raised a child has probably seen both of these many times at the dinner table. Child doesn't like how something smells. You can't get it in their mouth. Or they put something in their mouth and they don't like how it tastes and they spit it out. They're hardwired for that. And they're difficult to ignore. And so as we begin to think about racial identity, particularly as experienced in American culture, these affects, disgust and dismell, are also very much in play. And so it's to these racial applications I'm going to turn my attention right now. Now, I want to share a story from my childhood. My first conscious experience of race was a baptism into full-blown Southern racism. I'm a child of the South, born in 1953, so a child of the Jim Crow South. I was 4 years old, and I was with my mother in a local department store in Greenville, South Carolina. I think it was a Belk Simpson. It was I know precisely where it is. We were in this local department store, and I got thirsty, 4 years old, and I went for a drink of water. So this is 1957. And my mother found me drinking from a fountain marked colored. And she snatched me up and scolded me lightly and said that this was, quote, the fountain for colored people, and that I was not to drink from it. And she said nothing else to explain it. She did not explain, certainly, that we were racist and therefore we did not drink from the same fountain. And since there was no explanation, I was left with a 4-year-old's imagination to ponder the problem. And at that time, the only reason I could think of not to drink from something was because it was unsafe and unclean. The obvious conclusion was that colored people, as they were labeled, were somehow unsafe and unclean. And I recall that day wondering the whole day long if I had caught something and whether I was going to start to turn black. It's a silly, tragic example of many thousands of lessons woven into the experience of the Jim Crow South. Those lessons included not just ideas, but just as in this case, primal neurobiological reactions. Disgust and dismell are far more primary than mere racial theory. Ideas are easy to change. Neurobiological reactions are something altogether different. I first heard actual racial theory when I was 10 years old, attending a Baptist youth camp whose counselors were from Bob Jones University, and they were teaching just flat out plain that blacks were biologically inferior and tried to say it was scientific. 3 years later, when I was 13 years old, I attended a Baptist church for the last time in my life when my older brother, who was at that time a freshman at Clemson, walked out on a sermon that was being preached, was preaching segregation and railing against the planned integration of Furman University. And he left in disgust, and I went with him since he was my ride home. It was my introduction to politics and the beginning of a journey out of my Southern childhood. I recall that day actually arguing with my brother on the way home, since that's what brothers do. And, he had done something totally unheard of. He walked out of a church, discussed it at the sermon, and we argued about it. The end of that argument that day, I recall my brother spat in my face. Very painful day. It was also a huge wake-up call in the beginning of my coming out of a childhood racism. While reading Mother Catherine's small book on race, identity, and reconciliation, I was thinking about this deep programming of hardwiring in our culture. Jim Crow laws are gone, but there are many subtle ways in which these things still remain. And so if I take these thoughts to something less charged, for instance, than the racial context, say Appalachians, which is my own subculture, or part of my subculture, you can see some of the same things at work. For instance, a strong Appalachian dialect, which I'm not speaking today. I learned to lose it. But a strong Appalachian dialect is equated in our culture with laziness, crime, stupidity, lack of cleanliness, etc. And all of that is strangely an acceptable prejudice in our culture. Nobody marching about it. It's an acceptable prejudice with television shows, commercials, etc., that make use of these stereotypes with no compunction whatsoever. I mean, I hear echoes of it in my head when I hear phrases like trailer park trash and the people of Walmart. But that doesn't have quite the same charge that racism does. But we do this with various subgroups. The world has changed a great deal since my childhood. For instance, interracial marriage is now rather common when it was both unheard of and illegal back then. And there's a lot more interaction between the races. However, as many have noted, there are structural or systemic aspects of racism built into many parts of our culture. A lot of it, I'm sure, is unconscious, just as these hardwired reactions are unconscious. We oftentimes like them to stay unconscious because they're terribly embarrassing to admit you even have them, that these thoughts ever enter your mind. I think of the world of shame and disgust as part of the deep structure of our culture, if I can borrow that word from the world of grammar. It's part of the deep structure of our culture. There are no laws that can touch these things. They require the difficult work of healing within the human heart. I think it's also the case that these deep matters of shame, disgust, and dismay are themselves terribly embarrassing for us, as I said a moment ago. It's relatively easy to talk about economic injustice and police brutality, as terrible as they are, but it's frightfully difficult to admit the presence of these very deep-seated reactions. These are passions of a sort. But it's those deeper reactions that form the psychological framework for the injustice that marks our culture. At least it gives a framework that probably creates a certain sense of comfort in our culture, because if I can keep you separated from me, then I don't have to think about these things. I do not have to confront what's going on and what I feel inside me. If you're not there, out of sight, out of mind. But to think about the work of healing, I want to take us to the place of healthy shame. As noted in the quote from the book of Sirach, there is a shame which is glory and grace. I've been asked any number of times by people, why use the term shame to describe healthy shame? Why not call it something else? Isn't it confusing? I mean, for some people, shame is just always a bad word. But the reason is simple. The underlying mechanism for healthy shame and toxic shame is exactly the same. It's the same mechanism. They differ in intensity and cause. Toxic shame is painful in the extreme, and it can be completely paralyzing. healthy shame is painful in a small degree, but it's also essential to living a healthy life. It signals boundaries, for example. And a life without boundaries is very unhealthy indeed. So I'll take us back for a minute to the example I used of entering a cathedral. We enter and instinctively become quiet. It's an architecture that is designed to convey the divine. The German theologian Rudolf Otto, in his book, I guess published in 1917, The Idea of the Holy, one of the great classic theological works of the 20th century, he famously described this very experience as that of the holy other, the ganz andere, or of the numinous. In its presence, we are completely abashed, he said. In colloquial terms, this primary experience of God says to us, "You're not him." Well, this same experience also reveals the naked truth of ourselves to ourselves. Adam and Eve see their nakedness, which is true. They see the truth of it, that they're naked, and they hide. And a healthier story, there is Isaiah's vision. He sees the Lord high and lifted up, 6th chapter of Isaiah, and at the cry of the seraphim, "Holy, holy, holy," Isaiah cries out, "Woe is me! I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people with unclean lips." Or in the book of Job, in the 42nd chapter, Job, encountering God, said, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." Therefore I despise myself. And though it may sound like it, it's not toxic shame. This is a healthy acknowledging of the truth. He sees God, and in seeing God, he sees himself, even though it provokes this response of "I despise myself." This boundary is healthy. He acknowledges the truth, and so this is the beginning of a true and authentic existence. Some years back, when I began doing a study on the topic of shame, which frankly was out of a deep personal need to deal with issues of shame in my own life, I was privileged to spend some time with Archimandrite Zacharias in Essex at the monastery of St. John. He writes a fair amount about shame, sort of scattered across his books and lectures. St. Sophrony, his teacher, instructed him. He told him that when he first began to hear confessions, he said, particularly with the young ones, he said, "Teach them to bear a little shame." So in my time with him, I asked him about shame, and he spoke about sitting in the presence of God, acknowledging whatever shame it was I was feeling, and praying, "Oh God, comfort me." At its best, this can take place in confession. And I'll add parenthetically, and this is just very important, just something to underline here as an aside, that shaming others is not the job of a confessor. When he said teach them to bear a little shame, he doesn't say make them bear a little shame. The teaching is a much different thing. It is never the job of a confessor to shame others, and it can be extremely toxic. The abuse of shame is the very heart of spiritual abuse. And I just wanted to underline that because it's important. This gentle exposure, which is actually an exercise in vulnerability in the presence of God, unjudging, forgiving, and comforting, is profoundly healing. On a personal level, in therapy sessions, and I know that Mother Catherine is familiar with this technique, I've worked with personal shame in the context of EMDR, processing those powerful emotions so that I could come to a place that was bearable, that I could, in fact, it was one thing that was a shameful experience in my early childhood. that I had never even been able to mention in confession until I was 58 years old, but was tremendously liberating when I did and became able to do that. It's deeply therapeutic. Some psychologists have described shame as the unbearable emotion. It's painful, even in small amounts. Nobody likes it. Most of us avoid embarrassment, even in very light forms. Rather than experience shame, psychologically, we most often transform it, sometimes just simultaneously, into a different emotion, most commonly anger or sadness. That we are a culture that is currently caught up in a vortex of anger. Vortex isn't even a strong enough word. That we're caught up in a vortex of anger is simply symptomatic of the fact that shame is currently at an epidemic proportion. Makes the pandemic look like nothing. Those with whom we disagree, for instance, we do not think are simply wrong. We think they are evil. And we think and feel that, and this judgment brings with it deep feelings of shame and of shaming. The language of shame has become mainstream these days. It is also not a language practice that brings about transformation. You will not transform anybody by shaming them. It doesn't happen like that. Instead, it brings about anger and depression and various forms of hiding, reactionary cliques, all kinds of things. And so this brings us to the Orthodox Christian practice of bearing a little shame, healthy shame. We understand that repentance is made possible by God's grace, but that God's grace makes us aware of our sins. It reveals our shame. But in doing this, God is not crushing us. He is revealing himself to us, and in that light, we see light. The light of the truth of our own self and of our culture as well. It's good to understand that God himself has led the way in this, especially in the verses, I think from Isaiah, applied to the Messiah. I turn not my face from the shame and the spitting. In his Pascha, Holy Week Pascha, Christ enters into the depth of human shame. St. Sophronia of Essex said Christ has entered the depths of hell and is waiting for his friends to meet him there. I'm the descendant of slave owners. The culture that created slaves is part of my inheritance. There have been material benefits that come from that fact. Although I have to say, my grandfather, who was the direct descendant of those slave owners, had very little land and farmed. My other grandfather, who was a pretty strong racist, was himself a sharecropper. So their benefits were not like inherited money. But worse still, part of my inheritance has been a heart that was darkened from childhood with shame and disgust, not just racially, but elsewhere as well. The entire culture of black and white, as we think of it in America, is itself born out of slave culture and is marked by numerous, or a culture that practiced slavery, and is marked by numerous lies. My authentic existence cannot be found within such a culture. My authentic existence can only be found in the light of Christ and coming out of and being free of the lies of that culture. But we also need to sit with the truth, including the shame that goes with it. We should sit with it quietly in the presence of God. As it says in the Psalms, I have quietened my soul like a weaned child at its mother's breast. This is a place where healing begins to take place. It's a transformation of the heart. America and its modern mythology seeks political solutions for every ill. That's the hallmark of the modern world, is its confidence and trust in the political. And there's no doubt that there are areas of justice that can only be addressed by governing authorities, that laws should change. But such attempts at justice do not and will not heal shame. And shame is the far greater disease. We make bad laws because our hearts are bad. The hearts need to be healed as well. As an aside, historically, human beings have used various liturgies or liturgical events in the healing of collective shame. It's certainly one of the most powerful aspects of liturgy. American culture struggles with this. Often, our liturgical events are co-opted by division and recrimination, which only make the problems worse. I mean, for example, the Civil War can be seen as a liturgy of sorts, a bloody effort to exorcise a demon that had inhabited the land for so long. I mean, hymns associated with the Civil War, like the Battle Hymn of the Republic, revealed the deep religious nature of that conflict. And some like to argue, well, it wasn't that to start with. Well, yes, it was. Abolitionism was a deeply religious movement based on religious teachings and theology. And by the end of the war, had pretty well overwhelmed every other aspect of things. It was a terrible, bloody liturgy. But then over time it failed because it was insufficient and then got swallowed up in the institutions of Jim Crow. I think that the civil unrest, protest, riots that we've been having recently are themselves liturgies of a sort. We want to do something. We want to gather. We want to shout. We want to express rage. But I also don't think they will be effective in the healing of shame. Indeed, they're dominated by the language of shame, whether it's deserved or not. My shaming you, or even pointing out your shame, will not heal mine. It just doesn't work that way. The role of the church, and thus the role of Christians, is to live fully and completely in the role of Christ himself. We walk as he walked. We live as he lived. It's in that train of thought that I'm going to offer some suggestions as the conclusion of this talk. If we think carefully, for instance, about the text of Holy Week, we'll notice that the church focuses not so much on the pain of Christ's death, rather, it's the mocking and the shame that we pay attention to. The nature of the crucifixion isn't simply that it's a death, but that it's a shameful death. As Paul says, even death on a cross. It is therefore part of our path to acknowledge and bear the shame created in racial relations. We bear it so that in Christ it might be healed. The hallowed ministry, for instance, of fools for Christ consists of a willingness to bear shame. That's really kind of what a fool for Christ is someone who walks around bearing shame. And that willingness to bear shame, and in bearing it, to bring healing to others. I'm going to suggest 4 strategies, and I'm sure there's much more, but these came to mind as I was working with this. First, we have to tell the truth, especially about yourself to yourself. We will not be healed by our excellence, by saying, I'm not a racist. We're not healed by our excellence. We're healed by our weakness. In your weakness, my strength is made perfect, St. Paul was told. So we should think through our story, look for the feelings of shame and disgust within it. Identify them. Second, bring that truth into the light and sit with it. We can do this with trusted persons, including in the context of confession, though there's oftentimes not the sort of time in confession to do this. And I will emphasize in this that it needs to be voluntary. No one can or should demand that we expose our shame. That's a great way to make it toxic. And be sure that you're in a safe context with a safe person when you expose it. And by safe, I mean someone who's not judging, someone who will not use the shame as a weapon against you, but will allow you to expose it and be present with it and be a healing presence with you. Third, we need to overcome barriers where possible. That is, you can't be reconciled to others when we don't know them face to face. And we have to recognize that these barriers are charged with shame and embarrassment. Frankly, I think lots of white people, I can't speak for anybody else because I am what I am, but I think lots of whites are deeply embarrassed about not just their own feelings, racist feelings, but about the whole situation. And sort of are afraid to have conversations with blacks over their feelings or over the situation. I find it very difficult. It's hard to do this. It's one of the things that I think is the deepest value of the Fellowship of St. Moses the Black, is that its very presence and conversation reminds the Orthodox Church, particularly the Orthodox Church in the United States, in which we can do a history of orthodoxy in the U.S. as if racism belonged to Protestants and that it's somebody else's problem, when it's jolly well our problem too, because we live here and that's who we are. But having just the existence of this fellowship and its presence in conversation reminds us all of a shame that we would like not to admit. Its existence doesn't need to be suddenly a signal to say, well, I'm not racist, I'm a part of the fellowship, I'm not racist, I talk to others about this, or other ways we have of trying to signal our virtue. It just doesn't get us anywhere. All of this is necessary to the church in North America. So we need to acknowledge it and give attention to its healing and hope that more of this can happen, that doors are being opened to conversations that have oftentimes not taken place. I'll add, by the way, that I've read some about an organization in Atlanta, sort of a loose organization of black and white pastors, mostly evangelicals, who have formed prayer groups and gotten together and had people getting together across racial boundaries and building relationships. I was very impressed by that. It's something they organized back in 2017 after the events in Charlottesville, and the kind of thing that I would pray would spread to other places across the country, because it needs to happen far beyond the bounds of orthodoxy. Fourth, as much as we can, we need to bear our shame and not displace it. Even though many of our thoughts and feelings are a product of a culture that we ourselves didn't create, we have to take responsibility for ourselves. In this, I think the role of the holy fool is an important example. I could kind of easily imagine an American version of the novel, the Russian novel Laurus, wonderful modern novel about a holy fool. The bizarre behaviors would doubtless scandalize us all, but I could think of any number of ways this might be displayed. And it would reveal the depths of our hearts. Christ, I think, is in fact walking that path somewhere in our midst. And so I pray for us that we'll have the courage to take up that path when it's made clear to us. So there's my talk. Thank you.